So first of all, let me thank my colleagues in this, the Idaho State Department of Education, as well as Internet 2, in whose Washington, D.C. office we're doing this broadcast, and all of the partners in the Presidential Primary Sources Project. We've enjoyed working with them both this year and last. For the students involved, let me tell you, I'm wearing a bow tie today, and my own daughters know that that's sort of my own personal joke. It's like, oh, Dad, you're dressing like the museum director today. So I just want you to know sometimes people who wear bow ties take themselves very seriously, but I see this as sort of putting on a costume to help entertain you, so I hope that you enjoy it, all right? What we're going to do today is focus on Woodrow Wilson and the consolidation of presidential executive power. But we're going to warm to the subject in a couple of ways. Let me give a quick introduction, first of all. I majored in history in college, and some of you may someday contemplate majoring in history in college as well. And let me encourage you to do that, because the study of history is an important thing. As an academic discipline, it teaches you to read and to write, and also, I think importantly, to think. But also, the reason that we study history is not just to learn about times gone by, it's ultimately to learn about ourselves. And I think if you do study history seriously, this becomes obvious to you. But, but people who aren't students of history, it may not be obvious. When we study Woodrow Wilson and his exercise of presidential power, we're also going to be thinking about today and how the power of the president in our own government has evolved from Woodrow Wilson's time 100 years ago. So I'm going to divide my talk basically into two parts. The first half or so we'll spend talking about Woodrow Wilson and the history both of him and of the country in that era, so that you have a context. For the second part of the discussion, where we will focus most specifically on Woodrow Wilson's leadership as President of the United States. I'm going to figure out if I can do these slides. So here we are. This is a picture of the Woodrow Wilson House. I'm the director of this. It's a historic house museum. If you were to go here in Washington, D.C. 100 years ago, this house would have been under construction. It was finished in July of 1916, and then President Wilson and his wife bought it in December of 1920 and moved into it when they left the White House in 1921, and it's where both of them lived the rest of their lives. It's an interesting site because we have about 8,000 artifacts that were actually President Wilson's things, everything from art to his clothing, kitchen utensils, and presidential memorabilia and state gifts that he received as president. I have been the director of the Woodrow Wilson House for 3 years, and it's a fun job. You may someday think about a career in museums, and I commend that to you as well. If you're in Washington, I encourage you to visit, and please call and tell people that you were in this online class. I'd love to meet you when you have a chance to come to Washington. So when we study history, one of the challenges that we have is that we need to understand people in their own times that were very different from our own often. And this is a picture of the Johns Hopkins University Glee Club in the early 1980s, and one of the students there, whom you can see, was actually President Woodrow Wilson. I'll give you a couple of minutes to see if you can identify who you think that might be, and in a moment I'll tell you who it is. But the point is that people in history, we tend to think about, at least initially, as relating to the period that they're famous for. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson and World War I come immediately to mind. But we should always remember, with figures from history, that they too were once children, that they were once in high school, that they had loves and disappointments and passions and aspirations, some of which were frustrated. And that goes into making up who they are. And so I think it's interesting to think about the fact that Woodrow Wilson was born before the Civil War. He was a child during the Civil War, living in Augusta, Georgia. He was 8 years old when the Civil War ended. When he was 19 years old, and maybe some of you are about that age, was when the telephone was first demonstrated by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. And by the way, the very day the telephone was first demonstrated, one of the great coincidences in history, I think, was the day that General George Armstrong Custer met his demise on the Great Plains in what became known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So basically, Woodrow Wilson was beginning college around the time that the telephone was invented and the time of what we think of as Custer's last stand. It sort of helped set him in time. He was in the Johns Hopkins Glee Club, and remember, this is an era when they didn't have iPads or even phonograph players. He was someone who sang and enjoyed singing, and people would sing to each other much more in that era than we do today. So, does anyone think they know which student there became President Wilson? Can you tell from the way he looks? Back in the late 19th century, young men and gentlemen wore beards and mustaches much more than we do today. So if you'll look, President Wilson is in the back row, the second from the left, sporting a long sideburn and elaborate mustache arrangement that was very much in the style, I'm sure, in that era. One of the other things we need to do when we study people in history is to think about what they knew and what they didn't know, to put ourselves back in their shoes, but also in their mind and in their heart. And in that respect, we sort of need to unlearn some of the things we know that they didn't know. And so, for example, President Wilson was debating whether or not to enter World War I as America was on the sidelines of that war when it began in Europe. Wilson wouldn't have known that there was going to be a World War II. And so when we study World War I, we know there was a World War II, and we put it in that context. Of course, the people living in the world in 1914 had no idea of what history had in store. So let's turn now and think about this program, President Wilson and his history. And as we do this, the title of this program is the Presidential Primary Sources Project. And primary sources, of course, include documents from that era, but because I'm the director of a historic house museum that has, as I mentioned, over 8,000 artifacts, I would quickly point out as well that artifacts from that era are also primary sources. And as we go through this, I'm going to try to show you some of the things we have in the house and explain what those things tell us about the history and about President Wilson. Let's first set the scene with some biographical information. President Wilson was our 28th president. He served from 1913 until 1921, so for 2 terms. In his first election in 1912, he actually won a race in which, for the only time in American history, there were 4 serious candidates for president. He ran against 2 former presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and also William Howard Taft. And in addition, Eugene Debs, who was the Socialist Party candidate, and actually got 6% of the vote in that election. But Wilson prevailed. He was reelected actually 100 years ago this year in one of the closest elections in American history, and he prevailed over the Republican candidate Charles Evans Hughes. I think it's fair to consider that President Wilson was the most consequential president in our history between the time of Abraham Lincoln around the Civil War and the time of Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression. Wilson, I'm going to go back here just a sec. Wilson was born in Stanton, Virginia. As I mentioned, was raised in Augusta, Georgia, and then in his early teens, about your age, he went to Columbia, South Carolina. His father was a Presbyterian minister and would be transferred from one church to another. He moved around more than most Americans in that era. I can see some of you, so let me ask in a show of hands, how many of you are now going to school in the same town where you were born? See, how many going to school in the same state where you were born? See, nobody. And yet, well, maybe 2, all right, some of you. But I'm sorry, the satellite delay caused me to miss you. But the point is that in Woodrow Wilson's era, many people lived their whole lives in the same county, and it was not uncommon for someone to be born and die in the same community. But Woodrow Wilson was somewhat unique, and this is part of what makes him more modern, a more modern figure in our history, in that his family moved around a bit, and so he had different perspectives on life. He was raised in the South, but then went to college at Princeton, went to law school at the University of Virginia and got his doctorate or his PhD at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. So he really spent much of his adult life in the North and moved around throughout his life. In his 20s, he married a woman named Ellen Axon Wilson, and this is a portrait painted of her and their 3 daughters. This was painted when Ms. Wilson was the First Lady of New Jersey, when President Wilson had become the governor of New Jersey. Ellen Wilson was to die in 1914, about 15 months after President Wilson became president. She died in the White House of a kidney ailment, and he was greatly distraught about that. About a year later, or that next year, he met the woman who was to be his second wife in 1915. He met a widow in Washington, D.C. named Edith Bowling Galt, and they were to be married in December of 1915, and she served as First Lady for over 5 years. Now, Wilson was swept into office on what I like to refer to as a tide of the progressive movement, and so that's one of the words that I wanted to call to your attention is progressivism. Now, what does it mean? This was a movement that covered both the Democratic and Republican parties of that era, and basically, as it says here, it was a belief that the government can address social problems, inequalities, or inequities facing the nation. I would have to say that I think both political parties today are in some sense progressive in a way that political parties in the 1820s, let's say, really weren't. They didn't expect much from their government, and we expect a lot more today. And Woodrow Wilson's time was a period of transition in that regard. Wilson is known for, well, let's put it this way. I think when we evaluate presidents, we should hold them to 2 standards. How did they change the office of the presidency while they were there? And how well did they address the challenges that arose while they were president? And the biggest challenges that arose for Woodrow Wilson were in the international sphere. He was President of the United States when World War I broke out in Europe in 1914. You may have heard of the Lusitania. It was a British ship that was sunk by German submarines, and Americans were on board. And about 128 Americans were killed when the ship was sunk, and it created an international crisis. But it was 2 more years after the Lusitania was sunk before the United States finally entered World War I in 1917. Wilson went to Paris at the end of World War I and participated in the Paris Peace Conference. Here he is with the Allies, Italy, the leaders of the Allies, Italy, France, Great Britain, and President Wilson there on the right in that picture. At the end of that conference, he had convinced everyone to join a League of Nations that he had put together, and he came back to the United States with the hopes that the United States too would join. It did not. But today, and this is a picture of the United Nations building in New York City, although the United States never joined the League of Nations in 1919, 1920, at the end of World War II, the United States was as ardent as any country in the world to have a new organization like the League of Nations, and today we call it the United Nations. And so essentially Woodrow Wilson's idea eventually was accepted by the United States about a generation later. I think it's fair to say that one of President Wilson's most remarkable accomplishments was that he imagined the world at peace and then proposed a plan to achieve that vision. But we're looking today more at his domestic policy accomplishments, and let me turn to those quickly before we discuss his leadership qualities. By the way, this picture is what's called a stereoscope, which was in those days when really movies were just getting underway. There were photographs that could be taken where a camera had 2 lenses. You would take 2 identical pictures, and then when you looked at them in the viewfinder, and maybe you've done this, there are children's toys that do this as well, you would get a 3-dimensional impression, and this is a stereoscopic picture of President Wilson campaigning. Wilson was one of the most successful of our presidents as it relates to domestic policy issues as well. I think it's fair to say that Wilson was unrivaled by prior presidents in the success he had in getting through a whole range of domestic policy accomplishments, and really has only been eclipsed by later presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, in that regard. Among the accomplishments that we can point to for Wilson are the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, the banking system that we still have today, lowering the tariff, which doesn't sound that exciting, but it was the first time the tariff had been lowered since before the Civil War, and it allowed the federal government to be financed by taxation rather than tariffs, which was a boon to American business. He was instrumental in getting the Clayton Anti-Trust Act passed. You may know of, or you will certainly learn one day, of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in the 1890s, actually in 1890 itself. This was about 25 years later, and it was an embellishment on that early effort. So I wanted to present two terms to you to define. One is monopoly, and the other is antitrust. These were great concerns in our country in the Wilson era and leading up to the Wilson era. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson all had to figure out how to deal with the great trusts or combinations, or today we would say corporations, who were seen as controlling too much of the economy. And so there were monopolies where single corporations controlled a part of the market, and then antitrust was the effort to proscribe or prevent one player in the economy from having too much control, and certain activities like operating a monopoly or unfair trade practices were prescribed, and that was part of the antitrust laws. Other things Wilson did included the 8-hour workday for workers and child labor laws. The labor movement was really getting underway in this era. There were the big national unions were growing and developing, and so one of the other terms I wanted to present to you is collective bargaining. You may have heard about this but not thought about exactly what it means, but it's basically the idea that workers as a group, that is to say collectively, can bargain with their employer on the terms of their employment, prominently how much they get paid, but also the conditions of work on, let's say, the factory floor or otherwise. The Clayton Anti-Trust Act made it clear under federal law that collective bargaining was a legitimate activity of workers, and that was an important step in the labor movement. Wilson also was responsible for the Federal Trade Commission becoming into existence, the National Park Service. He created new agencies, including the Department of Labor and the Internal Revenue Service. He was the first president to have press conferences. He was very much a leader of his party and also a leader of the government. And I think importantly, I myself went to law school, and as a lawyer, I'm aware that Justice Louis Brandeis is one of the great justices of the history of our courts, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Wilson. So that's another great accomplishment. If you've been reading newspapers at all the past couple of months, you'll know that there's a national debate right now about Woodrow Wilson's legacy as it relates to race. And I think that's an important thing for us to touch on, even in the conversation we're having about Woodrow Wilson's leadership. Precisely because Woodrow Wilson was so eloquent in his expressions of human rights, and because he captured so well the ideals of America, and his imagination was so creative that he imagined a League of Nations and thought about how we could have world peace. Precisely because of that, I think it's very important that we examine the history of his racism and that of the contemporaries of his era. And so at the Woodrow Wilson House, we're redoubling our efforts to do programming that will address the history of racism in early 20th century America. So when you do come to Washington, I hope you'll drop by and take advantage of the programming that we'll have on that. One of the amazing things about President Wilson is that not only was he a president, but he was a political scientist, which is to say, as a professor, he studied government. And so not only do we have his pronouncements as president about what he thought he ought to do, we have his books and articles as a political science professor where he described the American government and thought about how he thought the president ought to act and what power the president ought to have. This is a portrait, by the way, of President Wilson wearing his academic garb. He was a professor at Princeton, where he had gone to college, and then ultimately the president of Princeton University before becoming governor of New Jersey and then ultimately president of the United States. One of the things Wilson said was that The government of the United States has had a vital and normal organic growth and has proved itself eminently adapted to express the changing temper and purposes of the American people from age to age. Now, that may sound to you like, oh yeah, that's boring, another president talking about something. But actually that's a relatively remarkable statement, and I would argue it's still controversial today. You may have heard people talk about strict construction of the Constitution. What Wilson is expressing here is that the way our nation was founded isn't the way it always has to be, and that even though the Constitution may not be amended, that over time the government will evolve in order to adapt to the way the American people are and the way the modern world is. The idea of evolving evokes the thought of Darwin and his publication in the mid-19th century. The ideas of Darwin are still controversial today, but they were certainly controversial in Woodrow Wilson's time. But he saw an evolution of the government and was, I'm sure, inspired in thinking about that by the idea of Darwin's evolution of species. And so it's an interesting thing that in history ideas take hold and then demonstrate themselves in a variety of ways. One of the terms that I wanted to define for you is the executive branch. We're about to discuss President Wilson's leadership, and he was the leader of the executive branch. You've certainly heard that we have three branches of government. I won't quiz you now, but you know, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. By the way, remember that. It's sure to come up on a test someday. But as the president, Woodrow Wilson was in charge of the executive branch. When you think back to the history of the late 19th century, you'll realize that the Congress very much ran our country. That's one of the reasons we don't really remember very well the names of the presidents following the Civil War and leading up to the early part of the 20th century. The presidents did not have a decisive and as important a leadership role in that era as they do today, and President Wilson was involved in the transition of that. One of the things we have at the Woodrow Wilson House is a set of the Woodrow Wilson presidential china. And this is a picture of that. And when you look at history, sometimes things people do that maybe they're not even aware of indicate something about them and about their time. Okay? Wilson was not the first president to have presidential china, but earlier china had things on it like birds and plants. But now we have china that has on it the presidential seal. All right, and this suggests to me that Wilson was at least conscious of the importance of the presidency and the importance of his office, that he put that seal on the china that they used at the White House. This is another quote from Wilson, and it is the government of the United States was constructed upon the Whig theory of political dynamics, which was sort of an unconscious copy of the Newtonian theory of the universe. Now, Whigs were like the moderate Republicans of their day, but the important thing is that he was saying that they were unconsciously relying on Newtonian physics. And I don't know if you saw this in the paper today, but astronomers are examining certain events and concluding that a theory that Albert Einstein had around the time when Woodrow Wilson was president about whether or not gravity has wave theory, you're thinking, I thought this was a history lecture, not a physics lecture. But anyway, that Einstein's theory may be proven by certain measurements that people were able to take just recently. And so Wilson is acknowledging that there was an earlier era when people thought in a Newtonian way, and that our founding fathers were of that era. And whether they knew it or not, they thought about the government as being very mechanical and very much like a Newtonian universe. And then he refers, as we saw earlier, to Darwin and thinks of himself as living in a Darwinian era. But what's interesting to me is that Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity was published in 1915 while Wilson was president. And I don't know that Wilson knew it, but even in his own time, Newton and Darwin were being surpassed in their intellectual capacity for creativity and whatnot by Einstein, who is the model on which a lot of modern American or modern world art and thinking and philosophy are based. So it's an interesting thing to see the passing of paradigms of thought, and Woodrow Wilson was to some extent aware of that in his own time. Wilson was highly regarded in his own time and was often compared to both President Washington and President Lincoln as a great president. One of the reasons was that he was a great orator. He spoke very well, and he knew it. And that's one of the reasons that he began giving the State of the Union as a speech rather than just a written report. The first two presidents, Washington and Adams, had given speeches for the State of the Union, and then President Jefferson decided that it ought to be delivered in writing, and that habit persisted until Wilson's time, when he reinstituted the idea of a State of the Union address, which our presidents today have embraced wholeheartedly. And Wilson did that because he saw it as a way to get his ideas out there and to persuade the people and the Congress of the rectitude of his ideas. This is an example of his leadership. I think one of the ways in which Wilson changed the nature of the presidency was that he decided that he would be a leader of the nation, not just of his party, but a leader of the entire nation. And using the State of the Union and giving it in person was one way that he was able to do that. So here's a picture of President Wilson giving a State of the Union address. Another thing that Wilson did that was a sign of his consolidation of executive power was that he established himself solidly as the leader of the government. And he appointed capable administrators to serve as his department heads. This is a picture of his first cabinet. I don't expect you to know, but I know the members of his cabinet, and so I can tell you which cabinet it is. But he chose important figures. You'll see Wilson there at the head of the table. Just to Woodrow Wilson's right is a gentleman named William Jennings Bryan. You wouldn't know him necessarily, but he was 3 times the Democratic Party candidate for president before this time, and basically made Woodrow Wilson president by giving his support to Wilson. And Wilson thanked him by making William Jennings Bryan his Secretary of State. To Wilson's left is a guy named William McAdoo, who was the Secretary of Treasury and one of the brains behind the Federal Reserve System. So he picked serious people who could run their departments with a minimum of input and supervision from me. He saw the president as being not just an administrator, but the only or the most senior nationally elected leader and someone who should head the government, not just someone who should respond to the dictates of Congress. So he delegated to his cabinet heads, and that was important because he went out of the country for 6 months, as we'll learn in a minute, in connection with the negotiating at the Paris Peace Conference. And later, when he had a stroke, he was bedridden for many months, and the cabinet was able to conduct the business of the government in many ways without him. You see here a quote from Wilson. He says, it concludes by saying, "There can be no successful government without leadership." Now, I have many friends, some conservative friends who would disagree that the president ought to have as active a role as our modern president has. But I also have many friends who went to business school or who run their own businesses who would agree that you don't get to a goal without managing toward it. And President Wilson saw that and tried to see himself as a manager of the nation. This is a picture from the Woodrow Wilson House, our museum, and it's a picture of Woodrow Wilson's library. And you'll see that chair there, that black leather chair. It's interesting to me that this was his cabinet chair from the White House. No, he didn't steal it. It was purchased by his cabinet members and given to him as a gift when he left the White House and came back into private life. But I think that chair is a symbol of his power as president and of his leadership of the cabinet. And I think it's also symbolic that the cabinet members would buy it for him and give it to him when he left office. Another way in which President Wilson consolidated executive power was in his role as commander-in-chief. From about a year and a half after Wilson was elected, Europe was plunged into a war that would become World War I. That began in 1914, and Wilson exercised his power and decided that the United States should not enter that war. 3 years later, in April of 1917, he went to Congress and sought a declaration of war. So his power as the commander-in-chief and as the president was to decide when and how the United States would enter that war, and we did under Wilson's leadership. This is another artifact we have at the House. It's a pen, and it is the pen that President Wilson used to sign the Declaration of War in 1917. For those of you living in the modern era, I point out the ballpoint pen had not yet been invented. This is a dip pen that he used to sign that act. He also then commanded, as Commander-in-Chief, American troops into Europe. There were 2 million American troops who went to Europe for World War I. We started the war with 200,000 men in uniform, and when World War I started, and by the end, we had 2 million men in Europe, and another 2 million still in the United States, held back and ready to be deployed. So it was a massive undertaking, the largest military operation in American history, and that also consolidated President Wilson's power. 117,000 Americans died in World War I, and President Wilson took very, very much to heart their sacrifices and those of all those who were wounded and whose lives were disrupted by serving in the military. This is a memorial to the 1st Division of the U.S. Army that was installed basically right after the Wilson administration as a memorial to the World War I dead of the 1st Division. When you're in Washington, sometime you can see that too. Another quote from Woodrow Wilson: when foreign affairs play a prominent part in the politics and policy of a nation, its executive, that is the president, must of necessity be its guide. And I think that's true, and we see that today in our politics. I live in Washington, so forgive me, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership is sort of a daily thing that we're aware of here. It's a treaty that the president and the other diplomats have negotiated with a number of countries regarding trade in the Pacific region. And the president got Congress to agree that they would consider the treaty as a single vote and not try to amend it themselves. And that's an example of what Wilson is saying. When you're dealing as a nation with other nations, you can't speak from 355 different voices. You have to speak as a single country, and the president is the person who does that. Wilson certainly understood that, and he says here his office, that is the president's, is anything he has the sagacity and force to make it. Now, this is an SAT word. Okay? You're in high school, so I wanted to bring this to your attention. Sagacity means wisdom, basically, and I don't want to hear that any one of you missed this on the SAT. Okay? Remember that word. Anyway, he's basically saying that the president can be as powerful as the circumstances demand. And that's a little different than I think you might see, for example, President Buchanan believing back in the 1850s. Wilson has a more expansive view of the presidency, and circumstances allow him to exercise that. So he went to Paris at the end of World War I to negotiate the Paris Peace Conference. He was there for 6 months, which is amazing. I mean, our president today goes to Europe for the climate change conference, and I think President Obama was gone for 3 days. Wilson went for 6 months, all right? He's the one who negotiated, or what I should say, promulgated the 14 points upon which World War I was ended. And he didn't have to take the lead in that, but as the American president, he decided this was something he was going to do. And his audience was the entire world, not just America or the Congress. When he went to Europe, he met with the leaders of other European countries. So this is a picture of President and Mrs. Wilson with the British royal family in probably it's December of 1918, but on the trip they made in 1918, 1919, to the Paris Peace Conference. So that's King George of Great Britain and President Wilson there in the middle. The American president had never met the British king before. If you think about it, our President George Washington wasn't going to meet with George III. That just didn't happen. But it did happen in Wilson's time, and for the first time. The president also went to Italy while he was in Europe and met with not only the King of Italy, our ally in World War I, but with the Pope. And this is a gift from the Pope, Pope Benedict XV, that we have at the Woodrow Wilson House. It looks like a fine oil painting, but actually it's a mosaic. When you come visit the house, you can see it's made of little tiles, and it's just wonderful work. But it's an expression of the Pope's confidence that President Wilson can bring peace to the world at the end of World War I. And then finally, this is the Order of the White Eagle. You can see that's a white eagle. This is an important thing. If you were from Poland, you would know immediately what this is. It's what's called a heraldic order that dates back to the Middle Ages. And only a handful of people in the history of the world have ever received this. And Woodrow Wilson received this from Poland because, I won't quiz you on the 14 points, but let me just tell you, the 13th point was that there ought to be an independent Poland. And President Wilson felt strongly about that and made sure that that happened. And as a thank you, Poland gave him this honor. That just tells you the importance of the president as our national representative to the world. So basically what I'm telling you is that I think there are 4 reasons why we can see that Wilson consolidated presidential power. The president as leader of the nation, the president as leader of the government, the president as commander-in-chief, and the president as the national representative to the world. Okay, and for all of those reasons, Wilson increased the power of the president, and I think it's fair to say that the changes he made 100 years ago are still changes that are in place today. Now, the president's power is not without limit. At the end of the Paris Peace Conference, when President Wilson had negotiated what was known as the Versailles Treaty, including what we've discussed briefly, the League of Nations, a group of countries whose purpose was to get together and talk before another war started and try to prevent a war. Under our Constitution, you may know, a president can sign a treaty, but it doesn't take effect unless it's ratified by 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. So President Wilson came back in June of 1919, very proud of all of his work, his 6 months worth of work, and presented the treaty to the Senate and said, vote on this. And the Senate said, okay, we'll think about it. The Senate was controlled by his political opponents, but they had serious concerns about whether the United States ought to sign a treaty that committed itself to go to war against another country that committed aggressive war. Our Constitution says that the Congress declares war, not the President. And the Congress and the Senate in particular felt quite concerned that they keep that power to themselves. And so, despite President Wilson's urgings, the United States never did sign the Versailles Treaty and never did join the League of Nations. President Wilson was a politician, and by the way, a very good one. I think that's fair to say of every American president. Don't get to be president of the United States without having some serious political chops. But anyway, when the Senate refused to take up the matter and it appeared they would not vote for it, Wilson decided to take it to the people. Now, you know that he didn't have Twitter, okay? He also didn't have television. He didn't have radio. He didn't even have electronic microphones in his era, okay? So he went by train across the country speaking to the public. I went to college at Berkeley. I grew up in California, and this is a picture I have in my office. It's President Wilson speaking at the Greek Theater at the University of California at Berkeley campus in 1919. And you can see there's no microphone. It's a standing room only crowd, and he's trying to impress upon people, using the majesty of the presidency and his great oratorical gifts, trying to impress upon them that the U.S. needs to join the League of Nations. And it's fitting that this is in a Greek theater, because at this point, I think, in Wilson's life, his story takes on the dimensions of a Greek tragedy. He thought that he had achieved this great thing. It would be the crowning achievement of his political career and of his life. And yet, America was never going to join the League of Nations. And a week after this picture was taken, President Wilson suffered a physical collapse, and about 2 weeks later suffered a stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and really unable to speak forcefully to the public ever again. So he was silenced, and silenced as an advocate for the League of Nations. So what do we remember of President Wilson? This is a statue of President Wilson from the Czech Republic, of all places. I mentioned before that certain countries think of Wilson as being involved in their establishment as modern nations. Many nations in Central and Eastern Europe hold our 28th President, Woodrow Wilson, in high regard. This statue is in front of the main train station in Prague, in the Czech Republic. There's a statue of Tomáš Masaryk, the first president of the Czechoslovakia, which is the predecessor to the Czech Republic, that is in Washington, D.C., just a quick walk from the Woodrow Wilson House. I often walk past it. They have three quotes etched in stone around the Masaryk statue, and two of them are from Woodrow Wilson. He really was a giant of his era. Wilson, this is a stamp that was made by the United States of Woodrow Wilson. I guess I would conclude by saying that Woodrow Wilson revolutionized the role of the presidency in our government, the role of the federal government in American society, and the role of America in the world. And for that, despite the weaknesses and flaws of his character that we can also explore, but for that, I think he deserves to be remembered, and those are the things that we try to emphasize at the Woodrow Wilson House in Washington. This is a beautiful picture of the house in sunset. So I invite you to come to Washington and see the house. And let me invite some conversation and maybe start by asking, are there any changes in technology that you can think of that were occurring 100 years ago that would have enabled or maybe necessitated Woodrow Wilson's taking a more active role as president? And I'll turn it back to you all. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So you think about technology, I can offer some hints, but I'll let you go first. Amy, I'm going to call on you because I know your name. That's not fair.
Oh. Okay, as you were saying before, they were beginning to introduce the phones, or the first telephone, that would enable him to do more.
That's right. That's a good example. Yeah, and also, I mean, the telegraph had become common, but yeah, the phone was invented. It was becoming more and more common. And not only did it allow him to do more, by the way, he used the telephone, but he never had one on his desk. You know, and here we are talking across thousands of miles using a phone. Pretty amazing. But it allowed people to talk with each other. It allowed news reporters to phone stories back to their paper. You know, if Wilson spoke one place, people could call it in from somewhere else. You know, but I mentioned he didn't have TV or radio, but he tried to use newspapers, and he was clever about this. You know, I mentioned that he gave the State of the Union address in person. Well, he learned this was really great because when he gave a talk to a joint session of Congress, most of the major newspapers in the country would reprint it word by word. And he realized this was a way to get his ideas out to the American people. So this will surprise you. I'm a font of Woodrow Wilson trivia. I don't expect that you would be, but President Wilson gave more addresses to joint sessions of Congress than any other president before or since. 22. And he used them. He would call a joint session of Congress. He used the president's power, and then would go down there and give a speech. Maybe it was directed to Congress, but at least partially he was giving that speech to the American people. And the best technology of that day was the newspaper. They would pick it up, reprint it, and carry his speech all across the country. So, you know, today we can do similar things with YouTube, but Wilson, of course, didn't have anywhere near the technology that we have. Are there things that you can see, changes Wilson made, that you can think of that we still expect or count upon or can see in our own government today? Amy, why don't you call on one of your classmates there?
I'm not sure what it's called.
Okay, sorry, 1 second.
That's all right. No, I've spent 3 years learning about Wilson. You're just here for an hour, so it's...
Sure. I have an idea, like, how I don't know if it was how he talked to the people. Before it was, like, speeches, like, with the first two presidents, and then it went to writings, and then it went to kind of, like, talks instead of speeches. I'm not sure. Something like that, kind of.
Yeah. Well, Wilson was probably the last president who wrote his own speeches. And speeches became an important tool for him and for the president. I think that's a good example. By the way, what was your name? Cameron? Yeah. Cameron, I think that's a good point, because today, the president has a staff of speechwriters. It's so important that speeches be good and that they achieve certain goals, that there's a whole science to this now, speech writing and whatnot. Woodrow Wilson wrote his own speeches in shorthand, and then he would type them with a typewriter that he had. The typewriter, by the way, was an invention of the late 19th century. Let me just read to you a sentence from Woodrow Wilson's first inaugural address. I thought it was a pretty good, because it's so typical of a Woodrow Wilson sentence. Sometimes I think, what's a good quote of Woodrow Wilson's that we could put on a coffee cup? And it's kind of funny because his quotes are arguably too long to put on coffee cups. He generally would speak in sentences that were like 40 or 50 or 60 words long. And I think this was partly of that era, but partly it was because he was a professor. But he was known for speaking to the people, not down to the people. And he gave them credit for their own intelligence. But this is a sentence that he gave in his first inauguration. He said, "There can be no equality or opportunity. The first essential of justice in the body politic, if men and women and children be not shielded in their lives, their very vitality, from the consequences of great industrial and social processes which they cannot alter, control, or singly cope with." Now that's a heck of a sentence. I don't think today you would hear a president give a sentence that long or that complicated. And yet Wilson spoke like that regularly, and people were charmed by it. They listened to him and they thought, this guy's really smart. And he was, by the way, he really was very smart. But he also recognized the frustration of that era. How many of you have read like a story by, let's say, Charles Dickens, about the Industrial Revolution in England, and children in poverty, Oliver, where he says, "More, sir?" The Christmas story, the poverty of people in that era, and the difficulty of a society in which the Industrial Revolution had given business people or capitalists unfettered freedom to do what they would. And Wilson's speaking to that. The Industrial Revolution came to the United States somewhat later than it came to Great Britain. But there were still excesses that he felt his office and his government ought to respond to. And so that's what he's talking about when he talks about industrial and social processes which people can't alter or control. It's a great expression of something that people should have said, yeah, what he said, that's what I feel. And yet he said it better than I could have. I think Wilson benefited from that sort of a sense. So before we wrap up, let me ask you all if there are any other questions you have. This is your great chance to ask. And by the way, just know that since I've been the director of the Woodrow Wilson House for 3 years, if I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up. So don't worry. Go ahead. Ask anything.
I'm the oldest in this group. Needless to say, I'm not in this class.
All right.
But I'm just wondering, my name is Howard.
Great.
What do you consider the single most important contribution by Woodrow Wilson?
That's a good question and a good thing to end on, because I think if I send our students out remembering one thing about Woodrow Wilson that they might think of again 20 years from now, it would be this. And I'll tell you, I come to this after having gotten this job, and I asked myself that question after a couple of weeks, and I spent a couple of months sort of wrestling because he did so many different things. But here's what I've settled on. Woodrow Wilson imagined the world at peace and then proposed a plan to achieve that vision. I said that earlier in this talk, but that is his singular most important accomplishment. I told you before that the Woodrow Wilson House was built almost 100 years ago, and I joke with my staff that if we're any good at our jobs, this house ought to be around for another 100 years. And I think it will be around for another 100 years. And that's because, amid everything else that went on in Woodrow Wilson's life and in the history of the country in that era, he was someone who, in a time when very few other people were thinking like this, he imagined that we ought to have an international body, a deliberative body where nations could come together and basically try to prevent war. And I think that idea and his sacrifices to make that happen are the things that will endure. And days when the first child labor laws and appointing Justice Brandeis to the U.S. Supreme Court may not rank as high 100 years from now in people's minds, I think the idea of founding the League of Nations will still be a signature achievement of his and something for which he deserves a lot of praise. Okay? So thank you today. I hope you enjoyed this. Tell your friends to come to Washington and come to our house. And Howard, thank you for your question.